Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
On today's episode, we're discussing two very different movies from two writer-directors who specialize in heady high concepts. They are Christopher Nolan's time and brain-bending thriller Tenet, and Charlie Kaufman's latest unclassifiable plunge into the surreal, I'm Thinking of Ending Things.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, Katie, so over the last month, we've been talking about the films of Christopher Nolan. We sort of went through his entire filmography and talked about every film leading up to the release of Tenet. Now, when we set up this series, when we started it back in the beginning of August, there was some uncertainty whether or not Tenet would actually be opening in American theaters. Just because films have been scuttling their release plans ever since the pandemic started. So
almost 6 months now.
Indeed, yeah. So, oh man, it really has been 6 months, hasn't it?
I realized that the other day, and it was a bummer. Sorry,
this is how we live
everybody
now.
out.
But so there was a question whether or not Tenet would be in American theaters, but the beginning of September has arrived.
And I remember loudly stating that I thought that it should open internationally, but not in America, to punish us for our bad behavior. But right. That did not come to pass.
Well, it did open internationally first, although that's fairly, at this point, that's actually somewhat common practice. American blockbusters will often open a week earlier in overseas markets, and then it happens here. True. I remember there being a big deal about a Captain America movie opening a week before, opening in Europe a week before it was supposed to open in the U.S. And it was like, that's Captain America, he's ours, you know.
Well, I was gonna say that when you mention that phenomenon, it makes me think of James Bond, and that actually makes sense to open in Europe first, because I have a friend who just loves James Bond and was, sort of half-heartedly, curiously pricing tickets to fly to Paris and see the James Bond movie.
Yeah, I mean, so the Bond film was actually the very first film to announce that it was abandoning its release date because of COVID. I remember for me that felt like that was like, oh man, so this is going to be a thing. And that is now scheduled for November, and I suspect that film will open in Europe in November, because they have their shit together a little bit better than we do here in the States. Whether it opens here is, that remains to be seen. I think the next few weeks are going to be interesting. I think if we see a lot of outbreaks traced to movie theaters, I think that the whole plan to continue opening movies over the fall may change. But right now, movie theaters in some parts of the country are open again. And Tenet is one of the films you can see there. One would say the big film you can see there. It is also showing at some drive-in theaters, which seems like a safer alternative.
Yeah, that was a pretty welcome development, because I think I even referenced it last week. I read an article in Variety about how Warner Brothers was reluctant to put Tenet in drive-ins, which seemed crazy to me. I mean, it's not as controlled of a viewing experience outdoors as in an indoor theater, but it is kind of the one way that you can say, hey, go see a new movie without there being any sort of moral ambiguity to it.
Yeah, I mean, because drive-ins are, for the most part, pretty safe. I mean, you're in your own space, you're in the car, they're outside as well.
Yep.
So if you
don't even have to roll down the windows if you don't want to.
Exactly, yeah. And if you do, I mean, there's a lot of airflow. It's probably the safest way to see a movie on the big screen right now.
Yes.
And I did actually wanted to talk, before we get into Tenet, we were going to talk about Tenet today, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the conundrum that critics are facing right now with theatrical releases.
Yeah, I believe I put it less eloquently as a clusterfuck when we talked about it last week.
Yeah.
A quagmire, whatever word you want to get into. Yeah, I like
quagmire. Last week we ran a piece on the site. I actually wrote a piece on the site about the AV Club's decision not to review The New Mutants. And The New Mutants, the famously long-delayed Fox superhero teen spin-off, which has been delayed many, many times over the past few years. It was shot 3 years ago or something.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
It was back when I was still writing newswires every day.
Right. So that film actually opened in American theaters this past Friday. So a week ago at this point. And Disney, who now obviously owns everything Fox after the merger, made the decision not to show the New Mutants to critics in any capacity. That meant no screenings, that meant no press screenings, and no digital screeners. Now, that is actually fairly common with in the before times, one might say.
Yeah, that was a thought I had too, actually. Like you said, it is pretty, not super common, but it's not unheard of for a movie to not screen for critics. And that's generally thought of as a sign that a studio doesn't have a lot of confidence in a movie. They don't think it's very good. And so they're anticipating a wave of bad reviews. That's how I always interpreted it.
No, and I think that's the most sensible way to interpret it. It usually is they think that critics are not going to like this thing. So in order to hold off the bad reviews and at least let something open on Friday without the bad buzz already in the air.
Right, exactly. It saves the Thursday night previews. Exactly.
Yep. And so what we'll end up doing usually when that happens, actually pretty much always when that happens during normal times, is somebody will just trek to a movie theater on Thursday night or Friday morning, buy a ticket like everyone else, and watch the film and then review it off of that. And we'll usually end up running the review that Friday or something. Obviously, things are different right now, and the whole piece was about us making the decision not to cover the New Mutants. Because doing so would require somebody on staff or a freelancer to basically put their life at risk in order to review this film. I honestly, it's a decision Disney made. I don't have a lot of contempt for them for making the decision. They can do what they want. It was a decision we made because, frankly, we just don't want to put any of our writers at risk over something like the New Mutants, or really any movie.
Right, yeah. Like when you say it as over the New Mutants, then you can be accused of snobbery.
Right. But it's not really about that. It's about ultimately what it comes down to is that I don't think anybody on our staff should be going to see a movie to review it if they can't do so safely. Where the issue kind of arises, and something that we've been grappling with, is some studios are going to be showing us their movies in a safe capacity. In fact, the week before, I covered the Russell Crowe thriller Unhinged, and I was able to watch that film via a digital screener. I was able, in fact, to watch it in a way that general audiences, in a much more safe way than general audiences will be able to. And that kind of raises the question, should we or should any outlet be reviewing films that are in theaters? And is there something hypocritical about us demanding for a safe way to watch something that audiences can't watch? Safely,
I think that, I think that where you start wading into some really murky water is the word safely, because, everybody has their own personal threshold for safety. Obviously, there are certain things that are just plain common sense and everyone should be doing them. But then you start getting into the area of like, what if it's an 11:30 a.m. matinee and no one else is there?
Right.
Is that unsafe? Then you start getting into, what if you have a theater that, this is kind of where my personal mixed feelings come in is, we talk a lot about the Music Box. We had Ryan Oestreich, who's the general manager, on the show a few months ago talking about that theater. And because I know Ryan, I know that he is very singularly obsessed with never, ever having a case of COVID come out of that movie theater. He's obsessed with it. and rightfully so, Like, it's bad business on top of being morally questionable. There's just no reason to do it. And so for that reason, I'm like, well, okay, well, maybe I'll go. I would maybe go to the Music Box during the day. But is that me being like, ew, I don't want to go to this general population theater. I'll only go to the clean one my friend runs. Then you start getting into that kind of like classic thing that people throw at critics of that we're like elitist and want special treatment.
Well, I think the reality is that unless you're in a situation where you do know the people running the place, or you have some kind of relationship with the theater, or they're very, very clear about how they're running it, I think it's hard to know how much these safety precautions are going to be, how much theaters are going to be taking them.
True.
And there probably are some theaters that are being very, very, very safe. And I'm glad that you brought up the fact that, like, not every screening, even at something like an AMC, you could go to a screening and you could be the only one in the theater, and in that case, you're getting you are seeing it in a more safe way than you and I saw it.
That's true.
Like,
that's true.
There are less people in that theater than the 10 or so people that were in the press screenings we attended last week of Tenet. So I think the real question is, do film reviews function in some respect as an endorsement to go to a movie? If you are reviewing a movie that is in theaters, are you in fact saying, here is this thing you can go see it?
Right.
I wrestle with that.
I mean, speak of a quagmire, that is the absolute biggest existential question about being a film reviewer, right? Like, what is the point of this? Are you telling people what to do, or are you just giving people that like movies a place to read about movies? I think if you look at it from the second perspective, then, their decision making of whether or not to actually go isn't necessarily tied directly to your review. However, at the same time, you don't want to give off the impression that, oh, no, this is totally fine, this is chill, because just when it comes to a big collective societal effort like this, we're seeing right now what happens when everyone gives themselves little personal exceptions, basically.
That's very true. We've been approaching it at the site. We've been putting a disclaimer on any film that is that's opening in theaters. Basically saying, before you go to a movie theater, before you make the choice to go to a movie theater, please be aware of the health risks and what experts are saying. We actually, our editor-in-chief, Patrick Gomez, conducted an interview with a couple of experts a few weeks ago, actually timed to when, so 2 weeks ago at this point, timed when Unhinged was going to be hitting theaters. That basically was, is it, the question sort of, what, is it safe to go to the theaters? And the experts more or less said no. Right. They said it's not something you should do right now. So we link to that at the top of every review of a theatrical feature. Is that enough? I don't know. I honestly don't know. This is uncharted waters. Like,
there's a lot of, gray area and complexities and case by case kind of stuff with this issue that I'm not gonna lie, I don't have any real answers on it. I keep going back and forth on it. It's been kind of like troubling me for the past week, this question.
I think it's been troubling our whole industry. And we've seen different approaches to it. I've seen critics who have said, not going to cover Tenet, not covering anything that's opening in theaters, taking that hardline stance with it. I've also seen outlets that just completely ignore the question altogether. I think that there are critics who are in New York and Los Angeles who have kind of been able to dodge even thinking too much about that, because theaters are not open in those places.
Yeah, because they can't have a press screening, so there's no question there. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And there are those that would make the case that film criticism often serves in a lot of respects as another form of publicity for a film. I mean, when we run a review on the site, we are in some respects, regardless of positive or negative, we are providing publicity for a new film. We are saying this is something you can go see. So in that capacity, we are contributing in some respect to there being an audience for these films. I will say, however, I think that people, I think for one, people have to make this decision on their own. And I think that one film review in one outlet is probably not going to sway somebody one way or another to go to the movie theater. If people want a review of Tenet, they could go to other sites if they don't find it on ours.
Yeah, and it is true, like, it is a little bit nanny state to say, well, we're just not even going to tell you about these movies because you might be tempted to go see one. It is like, well, adults can decide for themselves whether or not they think it's worth it.
I would hope so. And then there's the other part of my brain. I trust me on this, Katie. Last week, I wrestled with this a lot because
I know. I know.
yeah, because there is a part of me that thinks maybe it's a little hypocritical to basically say we will only see these movies if you allow us to watch them safely. However, we will review films that the rest of the world can't see safely. I struggle with it. I really do. I don't have an answer right now. I will be very curious to see what the next few weeks bring in terms of, are we going to see movie theaters causing, are they going to be super spreaders? Are we going to see outbreaks because of movie theaters? And what will that do to the release calendar? Will studios get gun shy after Tenet and decide not to open something? And how will that change these kind of discussions? All I can say to people listening is that it is something we're thinking about, and it is something that it's a kind of ongoing debate in the AV Club virtual office.
Yeah, it's definitely an ongoing thing, and it brings up a lot of really kind of basic questions about like the role of the critic and the relationship of the critic to the audience and to the work, and there's a lot of issues wrapped up in this. Like, it's kind of, I mean, I was going to say it's probably the biggest like controversy that I've encountered since I became a professional critic, but there was also kind of the Me Too reckoning a few years ago. But that one was very clear morally. I had no inner conflict about the morality of that situation. And this one I have a lot of inner conflict about
but I'm glad you brought that up too, because then the question whether or not to cover something is always an interesting one, because I do think that there are people who think that we should not, for example, ever cover a Roman Polanski film or cover a Woody Allen film. My feelings on that has always been, if you can find a way to acknowledge that in some way in the work, then I mean, these things are out there, they exist. We should engage with them, I think.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
I don't know. My personal feelings on that situation are just that, like, we don't have to pretend like their body of work doesn't exist, but it wouldn't be a bad idea for either of them to just retire. That's my personal.
Well, I actually would be shocked if we ever saw an Allen film open in the States again.
Yeah, well, considering the content of his last film that was reported, it was like, oh man. I mean, you're just not even trying to even look at any of this.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a whole other messy situation that I've had a lot more time to think about, so I do have an answer when someone asks me what I think about it.
Yeah. We're gonna keep. It's a discussion that is ongoing, and I can sympathize with those who think that it's unethical to run reviews of theatrical releases at all, and I respect that position. For the time being, we will be running them. We will be running them with disclaimers, just reminding people to please consider their health.
Yep, and if there's a drive-in near you, please do give it a go.
Yes. Enough of that. Let's talk about the movies. Let's enough throat clearing. Let's talk about Tenet. You and I both saw Tenet at a press screening.
In a mostly empty, gigantic movie theater, which was kind of cool.
Yep.
Even though I won't give away names, but someone did show up at my screening in a hazmat suit, and I was like, "Wow, where'd you get that?"
Pretty safe. Yeah.
Very safe. Dedication to the job. Can you imagine ordering that hazmat suit?
Yeah. So we talked about one of the things we talked about over the course of the Christopher Nolan series that we did over the last month, and again, you can find those episodes in the Film Club backlog. We talked about all of Christopher Nolan's films and his various preoccupations, including dead wives.
Well. Spoiler alert on this one.
There's an aspect of that in Tenet as well.
Yeah. A variation on the theme, one could say.
Yes, exactly. But one of the things we talked about was this sense that one of the things that I admire about Christopher Nolan, and I admire about his impact on the film industry anyway, is that he puts an enormous amount of trust in his audiences. He says, I want you to rise to these premises that I have. I mean, I think you could argue that Nolan is not... people tend to think of him as a cerebral filmmaker. I think he ultimately is a crowd pleaser who is enamored of very complicated plots and a few big conceptual ideas. But I do think that his films will often ask audiences to kind of meet him halfway. He's like, we are going to, at least structurally, I'm going to be doing something ambitious here. Try to follow along. And audiences, I think, have rewarded that trust. They've made big hits.
Yeah.
Out of these movies.
I appreciate that trust. I appreciate the trust and the faith in the audience's intelligence and ability to come along for the ride. You know, not everything has to be totally dumbed down.
Exactly.
To be popular.
And I'm kind of touched that audiences have been willing to go along with him. That films like Inception and Dunkirk that do have, at least doing something kind of structurally complicated, that those things have been these huge hits. So that gives me hope, honestly. But with Tenet, I had to wonder watching Tenet if Nolan's faith in the ability to follow along with what he's doing, if it might for once be slightly misplaced.
I wondered more with this one because I don't know if he has as much faith with this one as what I'll counter with, because I felt like the premise, the core sort of sci-fi premise of the film, doesn't hold up to any sort of even minor questioning, which led me to believe less that he has faith that the audience is following along and more that he's just like, yeah, don't worry about it. Like early on in the film, there is a line in the film where a character, I believe it was Clemence Posey, who plays her, the French actress, literally says, "Don't try to understand it."
Yeah, that is kind of to me that is the quintessential line of dialogue in the film. Although I will say that I'm going to say it probably is the quintessential line of dialogue because I maybe didn't catch 25% of the dialogue in this film because of Nolan's usual very muddy and somewhat counterintuitive sound mix, and the fact that he loves having characters deliver dialogue and sometimes exposition behind masks.
Yes, and also I think this one, it was exacerbated by the score, which is by Ludwig Göransson, who recently did that really cool score for The Mandalorian, the Star Wars Disney Plus TV series. He did the score for this one, and his score is he likes a lot of big, loud room noises, which is not unusual for a Christopher Nolan movie. But I think that the score exacerbated the sound problems in this one because it all sort of blended together into this big cacophony. And then you had actors delivering, muffled dialogue from behind their hand. And in the case of one actor with an accent. And so, it just made it really, really hard to understand. I joked afterwards with a critic that I know who was there. I said, I look forward to watching this on Netflix with the subtitles on.
Well, honestly,
I know what the hell happened.
And I said that in the review. I said that there's actually one case for not going to see Tenet in the theaters this week is that you can watch it from home and you can not only make like the characters and rewind, you can also put the closed captioning on.
Yeah, no, I think closed captioning would really help this film. I'm fairly open about it. I have to blast the TV and stuff like that. My hearing is not that great because when I was younger, I went to a lot of punk shows and I was, young and dumb and stupid and never wore earplugs. So now people have to repeat themselves sometimes and, muddy noises are hard to make out. And so I walked out of the theater going, oh man, maybe I should go to a doctor or something about this hearing loss. And then I asked somebody, I said, did you have trouble understanding the dialogue? And a couple people, including you, were like, oh yeah, no, it was really hard to understand. So
I mean, it's a reoccurring thing in Nolan's films. I remember when the teaser for The Dark Knight Rises came out. So they did the exact same thing that they did with The Dark Knight, which is that they gave us the first 7 or 8 minutes or something as a self-contained teaser on IMAX screens. So you went if you went and saw something, I believe at the time it was attached to Ghost Protocol, to the Mission Impossible film. But so you go to Ghost Protocol, and before the movie, you see this teaser for The Dark Knight Rises, and it's the opening scene of the film where Bane takes control of this big airplane and crashes it, potentially crashes it, and people were complaining right from there that you could not understand a damn word that Tom Hardy says. Now that's a Tom Hardy problem. Tom Hardy is always, I would say, about 80% comprehensible.
But Tenet was much worse than The Dark Knight Rises in this regard. I didn't really have trouble understanding Bane as much as I did understanding the dialogue, specifically the dialogue in this film.
Well, it's a problem.
Hard to follow.
It's a problem in Tenet too, because the thing is, a lot of Tenet's dialogue is expository. I mean, I don't think it's a twist, or I don't think it's a spoiler at this point to say that Tenet deals with time travel, which is fundamentally a complicated premise, one with lots of paradoxes and
famously complicated. Where the idea of making an airtight time travel movie has become almost a holy grail for sci-fi filmmakers because it's so full of paradoxes.
And I don't think Tenet meets that level. I mean, Tenet
not
at least,
even close.
Like a lot of time travel movies, it does have conversations that I think are basically lampshades that are designed to acknowledge the paradoxes that it's then going to kind of shrug off. You know, there's a scene where Robert Pattinson's character is basically just talking about the grandfather paradox, and then just kind of waves it off and says, "Well, we don't know." Which is about as honest as you can get in a time travel movie, I think.
Well, it's funny that you bring up those little touches of the characters basically going, we don't know what's happening either, because some earlier reviews of this film made a big deal calling it humorless, and that's an insult that's often thrown at Christopher Nolan, and I don't think it's true in general, and I don't think it's true of Tenet. Like, there's this, John David Washington plays the protagonist, the guy who, he's basically on a mission to stop somebody from doing something that'll make this backwards time travel thing that'll end the world as we know it, but also the world goes on and who knows. And that's my review of Tenet. But so there's a scene where he's sitting down to lunch with Michael Caine, who's playing a British intelligence operative, and Michael Caine basically goes, "You're not going to get anywhere with that cheap suit," and throws a credit card down on the table. And that was pretty funny. I thought there were some little humorous touches in this film.
Well, then he tries to ask, too, if he could get his food boxed up, and they're like, no.
That was funny, too.
I mean, his movies always have a sense of humor. The idea that he's humorless is silly. I think his films are often very grim, but they do leaven that with humor, I think, and Tenet is no exception.
And that was one of the things that I it kind of put me at ease a little bit, or made me kind of chuckle and be a little more relaxed about going along with this very complicated ride. The fact that the movie kept kind of looking, not literally breaking the fourth wall, but within the film kind of going, yeah, we know this doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, movie, cool. Then as long as we're all on the same page.
Yeah. So Washington plays a CIA agent who, in the opening scene, this movie has one of these kind of big, thunderous action scenes that Nolan likes to open his films with, very reminiscent of the ones that opened his second and third Batman films in some respects.
And this one is apparently reminiscent of a real-life event that happened in Russia.
Oh, no kidding! With the sleeping gas and everything.
Yeah. Yep.
It's fascinating. So yeah, it's at it's at a opera house in Russia, and some terrorists basically take over the building. They pump some sleeping gas is pumped into the ventilation system, so everybody there falls asleep, etc. Washington's character is undercover. He's a CIA agent. He gets made, and his team basically is burned. And rather than give up any information, he bites down on his official cyanide pill. But instead of dying, he wakes up to discover that he has been drafted into this secret society, this secret organization called Tenet. And
more secret than the CIA.
Exactly. Probably like the most secret in the world or something.
Yeah, secrets within secrets.
Yes. And their whole function basically is to, I think, track and stop the dissemination of technology, basically technology from the future. Now, early into the film, there's an early scene that for me sort of let me know what I was in for with this movie in some ways. It's when he's first kind of being let in on what the concept is. Inversion is what they call it, and the idea is basically that you are reversing an object's flow through space and time. So he it's a simple dialogue exchange where he basically learns about the laws of it, and there basically is a bullet sitting on the table, and he puts his hand over it, and the bullet jumps up into his hand. Now, This was the exact moment in the movie when I started to feel inundated with internal questions about the premise of this film.
Yeah.
I fundamentally did not grasp
I didn't either.
the scientific explanation of this premise, it's
just like how does Yeah, a lot of my questions have to do with putting human beings through this process. Like, how can you move of your own will, and how is speech not backwards, and like how can you just kind of move around on your own, but time moves backwards around you, but with an object that isn't a person, it's directly affected by the time. There's just a lot of layers. Just the way that humans move through this doesn't. It contradicts every single one of the few rules it is laid out at the beginning.
Well, as with Inception, they introduce rules and then they violate them, you know?
True.
I'm willing to go along with it in some respects. I mean, I think there are going to be people who are chiming in, listening to this, who are going to say, like, well, of course you didn't love this film, you just didn't get it. And maybe fair enough, but the thing about Nolan's films is that they often there usually is more to them than just the heady pleasure of unpacking their plots.
Right. Right.
You know, like even if you took away the complicated architecture of some of his films, there would be other things to kind of savor about them. You know?
Well, and also something that came up, I think, on every single episode we did about Christopher Nolan was someone said the phrase, "It's complicated, but it's not hard to follow."
And Tenet, I think, is the first one of his films where I felt that it is very hard to follow. And
yeah, I felt the same way. This movie made me feel like I was a big old idiot, honestly, in some parts. I understood the basic beats of the story, like I could follow the story, but all the kind of principle behind it was just really muddy and hard to figure out. Whereas, you know, a film like Inception that's similarly complicated in structure, I didn't have any of those kind of feelings. I walked away feeling like I knew basically what the idea was and how it manifested in the story.
Well, and I think that's largely because it does make sense, you know, like Inception does ultimately. I think that Tenet, I question whether or not Nolan even totally understands what happens at a certain point in this film.
I wonder if he cares. That's why I said
that
I
don't think
wonder,
he cares. Yeah.
You know, like I think because my impression was less like, I'm going to give you guys this puzzle, this code that's impossible to break and see if any of you can break it. I think it's less that than him just being like, yeah, whatever, don't worry about it.
I guess, but this is also the first of his films where I felt like there was almost nothing going on except the convoluted logistics of the plot. Mm-hmm. Like I really felt like he wants us to to try to follow along with this thing. And it almost becomes like it's supposed to be like its own reward. Like if you can piece this together, then congratulations, you win the new car. You know.
No new car for us then.
No, I don't think we get the new car. Which is not to say that the film doesn't have surface pleasures. I mean, I think
sure.
You know, I mean, like Nolan. I think this is the closest Nolan has ever come to making a James Bond movie.
Yeah, and I think John David Washington was such a great choice. He really he does that sort of soldier kind of stance really well, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. I know what you mean.
You get the impression of military training from just like the reserved nature of his performance, and also like he was a credible intelligence agent to me.
Yeah. I quite liked his performance as well, and I think some of it is the physicality that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I think it's also that the movie manages to toe the line between him being suave in the way that James Bond is suave, but also being kind of, in some respects, he is an audience surrogate in that, like the Ellen Page character in Inception, he is constantly having this world explained to him.
Yeah.
And his greenness becomes kind of sympathetic in a way. He's like a James Bond who doesn't entirely know what he's doing, but he is competent enough to kind of feel his way through, you know?
Yeah. It's a theme that came up in a movie much earlier in the year that... I'm not sure if anyone really remembers, even 9 months later, the rhythm section with Blake Lively. That movie similarly sort of dealt with the theme of an assassin, a super spy who doesn't really have any idea what she's doing. But I think this film did it in a much better way. It was a better treatment of that theme because it wasn't... it tied the threads together better, I guess. I'm not going to go into a whole review of the rhythm section. I believe we did a film club on it, me and Ignati. While you were at Sundance.
Yeah. I never saw that, but I can say that I can say that I really liked his general quality of he's like kind of a babe in the woods, even as he's this really competent professional, and that dichotomy, but the tension between those two things, I think makes him a instantly sympathetic character to follow, and
right.
I will say that he kind of basically takes everything in stride in a way that I found impossible. Like when the scientist says to him, "Don't try to understand it, just feel it," he kind of goes, "Okay." Whereas I'm like, I was like, "No, wait a minute. No, I'm gonna need you to go through that again."
Like, no, wait. I'm gonna vote no on this one.
I just think the issue is that Nolan is such a rational filmmaker in some ways. We talked about it with Inception, where his idea of dream logic is very rational and almost literal.
Right.
So for such a rational filmmaker, I think expecting us to just kind of go along for the ride and not have questions is maybe a little naive, because I could not just process this thing as, okay, it's a thrill ride whose plot is a little complicated. I was constantly trying to keep up.
That happens a lot with movies, particularly spy films that are from another culture, and there might be cultural nuances that you're not picking up on. Sometimes with those films, you're like, I'm just going to go on a ride with this movie. But you're right. I think it's because Nolan set the precedent that he's set of having all of his previous puzzle boxes be solvable.
Right.
In essence.
And I don't doubt that there's somebody, again, I know that we're going to get somebody who's like, excuse me, this is actually very clear. And there's going to be somebody who maps it out very clearly where all the people are going. Nolan, at one point in the film, I had to laugh at this moment. There's a moment where there are a number of soldiers, and some of them are moving forward in time, and some of them are moving backwards. And to just give us a little bit of assistance in following what the fuck is going on, he basically gives them armbands that are different colors. So it's like, oh, the ones moving backwards, they have the blue armband, and the ones moving forward, they have red. And that sort of felt like Nolan acknowledging, people are going to have a hard time with this, aren't they?
Another thing about, we talk about with Nolan a lot that I kind of enjoyed about Tenet, although I'm not sure that it really reflects on the film as much as it's just an observation that I had, is that I found it kind of charming that he made this really complicated plot around one of the absolute easiest special effects to do in camera, which is just you just shoot something forward and then you play it backwards.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's such an easy in-camera trick to pull off, but they built this super complicated story around that, and I thought that was kind of charming.
I think that squares with Nolan as a blockbuster filmmaker because, his films have tons of special effects, and he uses CGI like any other modern blockbuster filmmaker. But when he can do something practically, he does. I mean, this is a guy who literally flipped a semi in The Dark Knight. He was like, I want to do this as practically as possible. I think I read that there's a scene in this film where he basically blows up a jetliner. And I think I read he did that for real. And I think that Nolan, in so much as you can look at a film that has as much special effects as this one or any of his other big movies have, as much as you can say those films are analog, he is kind of an analog player in a digital world in that respect.
Yeah, and this is it's a very analog. It's literally one of the oldest tricks in the filmmaker's playbook is to just play the film backwards.
I will say that I thought the action in this is very confidently staged. I mean, at this point, Nolan really knows what he's doing with that kind of spectacle.
Sure. Especially the opening heist scene I thought was pretty thrilling.
Yeah, really well done. I will say that I did not think that anything that he shows us in this movie is something we have not seen before, and maybe even a little better in a Nolan movie. There's a scene in this film when John David Washington is fighting this masked figure in a hallway, and the figure is moving backwards, and it honestly to me felt like an echo of the much better hallway fight in Inception. It felt like
I thought the exact same thing. I even wrote it down.
Yeah, it's just like instead of dealing with the laws of gravity, instead of subverting the laws of gravity, subverting the laws of time. But it doesn't, it honestly does not, it plays like a lesser version of that scene to me.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I thought the same thing. Then the film does play as like a greatest hits reel at times.
It certainly does.
Well-dressed men in speedboats talking about, very serious cryptic terms about the future of the world, all very on point.
So where does it sit for you in his filmography? How do you feel about it?
Oh, I would put it on the bottom end of the middle. I haven't really given it I haven't really sat and done a serious ranking, but it's not top 3. Certainly not.
Yeah. I think it's my least favorite of his films, to be honest with you. Yeah. I think it's the one that feels the most like just empty smoke and mirrors. It's the one where he is... I just think there's so little going on in it on a dramatic level that it really is just a bunch of his obsessions strung together and tied up into this plot, which I think is frankly flirts with incomprehensibility at times.
Well, that raises a question for me, which is: has success spoiled Christopher Nolan? Has him, following his personal obsessions and taking people on these rides and everybody going along with it and it working out critically and commercially? Has it spoiled him? Is now he just at that point that sometimes artists get when no one's willing to tell them no, where like their every little whim they think is, terribly important when maybe it's not.
Yeah,
maybe there was a better idea down the road,
Yeah, did some studio exec need to say, Chris, this movie makes no sense. Like I know we followed you, I know it'll be a hit, but like, buddy, this does not make a lot of sense. I think you're right that I think he's at the point in his career, and I find this thrilling in some respects, and it's largely unprecedented among filmmakers working with his kind of budget. He is at the point where he can do, I think, largely what he wants. This, to me, does represent the drawback of that. This is what happens when you get a filmmaker who is doing anything that he wants.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I look forward to the explainer videos coming up on YouTube because I, for one, need them.
Yeah, I'm going to watch them. I think that's a solid segue into the second film we're going to talk about today. And that's the new Charlie Kaufman film, I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Kaufman is, in many ways, Kaufman has had a career completely different than that of Christopher Nolan. He has never worked in the field of mega-budget blockbusters. He's never made anything that I would call a pure crowd pleaser by any stretch of the imagination. But
his films are very distinctive.
They're very distinctive, and I think that he is somebody like Nolan who has never really made a film that didn't express in some way the way that his brain works. And this goes back to his career as a screenwriter. I mean, Kaufman obviously was not directing his films for a while. I believe he started in television. He wrote on some sitcoms. The first of his screenplays to get adapted, though, was Being John Malkovich, to get shot, rather. And Malkovich immediately established him as somebody who thought like nobody else in Hollywood. I mean, it's the type of adventurous premise that that nobody else could have. Nobody else had the gumption to come up with what he came up with there. And a few years after Being John Malkovich, he reunited with director Spike Jonze and made Adaptation. And Adaptation was his adaptation of a nonfiction book by Susan Orlean about flowers, essentially. And he made that thing as much his own as you can possibly imagine, to the point where he inserts himself into the story. I mean, it becomes the whole thing. He adapts the book and turns it into a study of him trying to adapt it. My point ultimately is that Kaufman has, like Nolan, has spent most of his career doing things his way. And I think, unlike Nolan continues to get these enormous budgets. I think he's struggled over the years to sometimes get a project off the ground. They don't come all that frequently for Kaufman.
Yes, which is a much more common fate for a singular voice as a filmmaker, unfortunately.
This one, though, is it's called I'm Thinking of Ending Things. It's being released by Netflix and was funded by Netflix. And kind of makes the case for, when we talk a lot about, we could do a whole episode, I think, on whether or not Netflix is good or bad for the movie industry.
Oh yeah.
Maybe we should do that one day. But I think that one of the cases you can make for Netflix as being a force of good, regardless of their motives, one might say, is that they are funding projects that other studios won't necessarily touch. And sometimes
they fund them too. They don't just pick them up.
sometimes
they pay for the whole production.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they pick them up. I mean, something like Roma was not made with Netflix money, but they are funding films. I mean, they gave Martin Scorsese $100 million to make The Irishman.
Right. Right. Yeah. You're right. They do both, but
yeah.
I mean, if you want to talk about it at Netflix in the sense that I think that what you're getting at is that they're kind of keeping the auteur-driven film aspect of filmmaking going. In that sense, a lot of the time they're giving people money from script to marketing.
Yeah.
Just paying for the whole thing, and that is immensely helpful.
It is.
Filmmakers that struggle.
And I think that Netflix is, if I had to guess, I would say that Netflix probably feels pretty okay about their position right now. I'm also willing to guess that people are watching a lot of Netflix at this particular moment.
Yeah, their last valuation, they were bigger than Apple, so.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, there was for a few years there, they were
Pandemic's been good for them.
Indeed. I mean, they don't even have to, for a while there, it was like, there was pushback from both, I think, from audiences or from cinephiles and from filmmakers to make sure that their films got theatrical releases as well. It was like, we'll go with you, Netflix, but you have to make sure that we get on screens. Right now, because of the pandemic, I feel like Netflix is sort of doesn't even have to do that. So they can take something like this Charlie Kaufman movie and just immediately put it on their streaming platform.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they did eventually give in to the theater thing, which I think was going to be necessary if they, well, it's certainly necessary if they want to win Oscars because films have to play in a theater to win an Oscar. Yep. I think they as of like last fall, I think was when they really started capitulating to putting their films out in theaters as well. I mean, it makes sense. If they want to really play the big game, then there are a few rules that they have to follow.
I think it's an optics thing too in some respects. It's not. I don't think it's just about the rule that the Academy says you have to be in theaters. It's about you've seen this divide between Netflix movies that never have any intention of playing anywhere but Netflix. Like
junkie programmers. Festivals are full of those now.
Yes, and they're like in the stuff that is sort of where they're kind of trying to colonize. They're like trying to like horn in on Lifetime and Hallmark's business too, with things like like holiday films, Christmas films that I think never have any intention of opening in theaters. They know what they are. They are basically just
and the teen romances like the Kissing Booth movies.
Right.
They've made a nice little cottage business for themselves doing that. And good for them. Not everything's got to be a prestige picture. This is a tangent, but the star of the Kissing Booth, Joey King, she actually gave what I thought was a very mature statement she was like, listen, I've been in stuff that critics have loved and I've been in the Kissing Booth movies and I understand that not everything is, is going to be a critical favorite and that's okay because other people did like it and I'm going to do more stuff in the future. This is the only thing I'm ever going to do, so I'm not too worried about it. And I was like, thank you. That's very mature, Joey King.
I like that. But I'm thinking of Ending Things is the type of project that I think that you would hope that Netflix would always be funding, honestly. It's the type of thing that if the studios are not going to pick this thing up, then thank God Netflix is around to do that. And I think the truth is that even in a career as strange as Charlie Kaufman's, even in a career as uncompromising as Charlie Kaufman's, I think this is among his weirdest and most potentially alienating movies, and I mean that as a compliment, honestly.
Well, it's funny you say that. That is fascinating to me because this is the first Charlie Kaufman movie I've ever seen where I actually identified with the main character.
Do you think that's possibly because he actually has some interest in a woman this time?
A woman's with an interior life, perhaps. Yeah, well, I mean, sure, yeah, that's probably it. But I was just like, wow, what a wonderful new world we're entering, where I see myself in a Charlie Kaufman movie, and I hope my ex is not listening to this podcast because the first half of it was a little too real.
We should say what the film is about. Because it seems ostensibly simple, even for Kaufman, because Kaufman's plots often are built on some fantastical conceit, and for a little while anyway, this one seems pretty simple. It basically is about a woman who may or may not be named Lucy. That will become increasingly unclear, but when we meet her, she's her name appears to be Lucy, and she's played by Jessie Buckley, and she is going on a road trip with her boyfriend of about 6 weeks, played by Jesse Plemons. And they're going to meet his parents, basically. He lives in, his parents live in, downstate New York, and they are driving through kind of worsening weather conditions to go and for just a night and to have dinner with his parents. And initially, the film appears to just be about this tense relationship between them, because we learn very early on the opening voiceover, she indicates, "I'm thinking of ending things," which obviously can be interpreted in a couple different ways. I mean, there's a suicide dimension to that, but I think in the
that's what I thought it was from the promo materials.
Right. In the most literal sense, at least as we understand it at the start, she is talking about thinking of breaking up with her boyfriend.
Yeah, they've only been dating 7 weeks, but it feels like forever, and they're meeting the family, and by all external markers, this is a great relationship that, you know, could last for a very long time, but in her head, she's already out the door. She's just trying to think about the best way to do it.
Which I think is an intensely relatable feeling. Honestly.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I found it so, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all been in relationships that have seemed on paper to make sense, but you can't shake the feeling that there's something wrong with them. You know,
or something wrong with you, because you're but this all seems great. Why aren't you happy?
Why don't I like this person? Exactly. Yeah. Or why doesn't it feel right with this person? You know. And it's kind of the opening stretch of this movie, I think, has a really it's really precise in the degree of social awkwardness it's capturing, just the kind of shifting emotions of this kind of trip that you might take with somebody when you're like 6 weeks into a relationship with them. You know. Like, he is such an astute student of like social discomfort.
Yeah, there's some really I'd be curious to hear the book, because I felt like the first half of the film that you're talking about, where they go to his parents' house to meet his parents, I felt that there was a lot of really kind of savage satire of a very particular type of, in this case, you know, upstate New York, but I've seen it manifested in a certain kind of Midwestern politeness, I found it to be a really savage satire of the very, I guess, white American sort of culture of, we're just going to put a big smile on our face and tell the same story every single time we see each other, and never, ever, ever say what we ever mean.
Yeah, 100%. I agree completely. Even though it is set in like mid or downstate New York, it feels very Midwest to me. And we both grew up in the Midwest. And the particular vibe of that household and of the way that Plemons' character interacts with his parents. His parents, by the way, are played by David Thewlis and Toni Collette. Yep. And I honestly thought of like that Eraserhead dinner table scene, as though like Kaufman had looked at that and said, how can I make this a little bit closer to reality, but also like take its general awkwardness and unease and extend it over a solid, maybe almost like close to a solid hour of running time.
Yeah, almost a solid hour. And as it starts to get more surreal, like at the beginning, before it goes into full on absurdity, there's these little times when it's just very heightened and surreal. And literally, it felt to me like being on acid. Yeah. Like being in that situation on acid, like meeting your boyfriend's parents, and you're like, oh.
But you're like high.
You know, like. Yeah, like the drugs are kicking in, and you're like, ooh, oops. You know?
Yeah.
That's never happened to me, but that's what it would be like, I felt like.
That's like a nightmare you can imagine.
Yeah, totally.
So this kind of surrealism starts creeping into the film at a certain point. I think a little bit more slowly than it does in something like Synecdoche, New York, which is Kaufman's directorial debut from maybe 12 years ago or so. I think there's some commonalities between that film and this one, at least in the sense that it's kind of casually surreal, almost like real life is being hijacked by some other reality. You know, I think that all of Kaufman's films are in some respect about being locked in your own head, when they're not about being locked in his head. You know? Yeah. And this one, I think, is very much about that. I think the way that it distends reality and starts playing with things like time. Yes, like Tenet, this is a movie that does play with time in a very different way, though. In the way that time people's ages start changing and physical details start changing. I think that all has to do with the way that a person's mind is shifting.
Totally. And I agree with that in the sense that I know that I made an acid reference earlier, but I don't think that it's like overtly hallucinatory as much as it is like a nightmare, in the sense that it's sort of like taking like sort of internal feelings, distressing feelings, and externalizing them in symbolic ways.
Yeah.
So it's more like a dream than a hallucination.
I think it's like being trapped in somebody's head, in a way. And again, I think that all of Kaufman's films kind of put you into his brain. I think he is somebody who has made his particular unhappiness he's kind of made a show of that. I mean, I don't know much about his personal life. He's actually somebody who's pretty guarded about that, and I wouldn't presume to look at his work and try to get any understanding of what his life is like. I will say that he is somebody, as a writer and afterwards as a writer-director, who has always at least seemed to turn the anxieties of his brain into this funhouse that we all have to navigate, you know?
Yeah, and funhouse is such a great word for the sort of building tension in this movie. The way that I described it in my notes was, I wrote that it's like a bad relationship as like a haunted house. It's like this emotional haunted house that she's trapped in. Oh, and by the way, being the old lady with bad hearing that I am, I did watch this one because it's a Netflix film, so obviously we watched it at home. I did watch this one with the closed captioning on. And in the closed captioning, they just call Jessie Buckley's character the woman.
I know, and that bothered me a little bit, because honestly, for me, that kind of immediately foregrounded certain shifts in reality that he is going to do going forward. It foregrounded it immediately in a way that the film doesn't necessarily want you to, because when we meet her, she's just Lucy. That's how she's introduced. And then shortly thereafter, her name starts changing. Details about how they met start changing. Basically, he starts shifting the floor underneath our feet.
Yeah, and what she's studying at school. She's a physicist, and then she's a painter, and then she's like a film theory student. And they have a long discussion about Cassavetes, a woman under the influence.
Yes, which that is such critic bait, because he is basically just that in that sequence. She is just speaking verbatim an entire paragraph of text from Pauline Kael's review of that film. So she just turns into Pauline Kael for a few minutes of the film, and her voice changes too.
Yes,
she's like doing the Kael accent. Yeah, exactly. But that is a clue towards what might or might not be going on in this movie. We should say that the film is an adaptation of a book, like his earlier adaptation. It is the book of the same name is written by Ian Reid, a Canadian writer, and I sometimes when I'm reviewing something, I will try to at least skim the source material to get a sense of what it's like. I read this thing cover to cover, pretty much. I mean, I read it over a couple days.
I'm so glad you did, honestly, because, there's a lot to talk about in terms of adaptation with this one.
For sure, because in a lot of respects, I think that, and again, this is, if you're thinking that you might, if you watch this and you're thinking you might want to read the book, it's a very quick read. It's like maybe 200 pages, but you can read it in one sitting if you have the evening free. And I was pulled in immediately by the book. The book has the exact same setup. And in a lot of respects, it's faithful to the basic architecture of the story. And a lot of the themes that Reid is setting up. But the tone is a lot different. I mean, for one thing, Reid's book is kind of a psychological horror novel in a lot of ways. And
okay. Because I kind of felt like I was reading some of that into the movie, you know, the haunted house comparison. I felt like I was projecting my own life onto the film a little bit.
No, it's there, though. I think it really is there. I think this thing could be a horror. I think we would not hesitate to call this thing a horror movie if Kaufman approached it the way that the book does. And the book is constantly looking at these moments and finding like pinpricks of unease in them. I had to put it down a couple times because it was like spooking me, you know?
Oh, wow.
Like I was getting spooked reading the book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I don't want to talk too much about the ending of this film. It is this movie eventually takes a plunge down the rabbit hole that is that is naughty in a way that Tenet is not. Tenet is just confusing because you can't always figure out what the hell's going on. This thing
I think this is better thought through than Tenet, I think.
Very much so. This film, I think, at a certain point, gives up any sense of rational reality, and just gets...
Can I drop one little enticing little hint? Because this is something I just loved about the movie. It doesn't give too much away. It's got an extended ballet sequence, which, I love a ballet sequence. I love it. Give me all that red shoes stuff all day long. I love it.
I love that too. I mean, they established at a certain point that her boyfriend Jake is a musical fan. And the movie pays that off in some ways that are quite lovely, I think.
I really liked that aspect of it.
What fascinates me, and again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. I think in a lot of respects, the place that the book lands is very, very literal.
Okay.
Like, there is an explanation for all of the weird shit that starts happening. And what's interesting to me is that Kaufman doesn't necessarily reinterpret that. It is the same explanation of what's going on. What he does, though, is that instead of just basically coming right out and saying this is what's going on, which is essentially what the book does, he abstracts that information. So the climax of the film, instead of playing like a twist, it plays like a abstract expression of what is actually going on.
Right. Yeah. And it's not the ballet sequence. Like, this is on top of that.
I
just want to clarify that this is different.
No, I mean, I think that you could solve this thing like a puzzle if you wanted to, and there are clues sprinkled throughout. I have the luxury of having read the book, so I can look at certain choices. At one point, he parodies a certain Oscar-winning movie. I'm not going to say on here what that movie is, but that movie is one of several clues to what is going on in the film, I think.
Oh, wow.
But he just kind of lets it sit there because the book feels the need at a certain point in a somewhat deflating way. And I should say I quite liked the book. I recommend reading it if you have a spare 3 hours even. But the book at some point, I think, is a little deflating in just saying this is 100% what's happening. And Kaufman, in a lot of ways, by abstracting that information, he both makes it feel less disappointingly conventional, and at the same time allows for multiple interpretations of what's happening, you know?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I definitely want to watch this movie again because I really, really, really liked it. And also, so like I felt like it was all very emotionally resonant, and all the symbolism like made sense to me, and it all kind of moved along, and I felt like me and the movie were moving on the same level until that last scene, which I was kind of like, I'm not really sure what this scene is trying to say. And then you said the book is more literal.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of on the fence of whether I want to just keep watching the movie until I make my own theory, or if I want to read the book and find out what the actual explanation is.
I don't know what to tell you because I think honestly I can only see it through the lens of somebody who has read the book and who read the book very shortly before seeing the movie. But I sort of like the idea too of just taking this thing on its own terms because I do think it's a rich enough text that there are a lot of different pathways of interpretation with this film.
Well, let me ask you one question about this film. So kind of the way that you described it and the way that I've seen a couple other reviewers describe it is as it starts off as this one thing and then it moves and then it goes really crazy and it goes on these crazy flights of fancy. But I felt like the movie kind of like expands and retracts the surrealism throughout. Like you'll have a part where it's pretty normal and then it gets really abstracted and then it goes back down to earth a little bit and then it gets really abstracted and it kind of like, it just kind of keeps, like I said, expanding and retracting that way.
I 100% agree. It's what Matt Groening calls rubber band reality. He says that you can stray away basically from the reality of a moment and then you can zip us back into it. And we talked about the scene where she suddenly becomes she basically just becomes Pauline Kael during this conversation they're having about a woman under the influence. That is such a perfect demonstration of this because that moment takes us completely out of the objective reality of this relationship and their lives. Suddenly, she is somebody else entirely, and they're having this strange conversation. But then, right afterwards, she is back to the character that we know, and we're back. We're right back in this situation that they're in, and the emotional reality of this situation. I'm honestly kind of blown away that Kaufman is able to navigate those, that he's able to take us so far outside of the literal reality of what we're seeing, but we still rubber band back to the emotional reality of these characters.
Yeah, I think the emotional reality is what keeps it, grounded in that, like we were saying before, it is a very the very basic reality of what's happening, that it's a couple in a kind of a bad relationship that is nevertheless marching forward with their relationship. That's a very relatable scenario, and if you can relate to that scenario, then the absurdity and the symbolism still contains that emotional resonance, and so it ebbs and flows very naturally, I think. That's all we've got for you for this week. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is streaming on Netflix now, and Tenet is open in theaters, although if there's a drive-in near you, we suggest possibly checking out that option. In the meantime, you can find Film Club wherever you get your podcasts. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Film Club will be off next week, but we'll be back with a brand new episode on September 18th. Thanks for listening.
Bye, everybody.